He had endured the grueling and humiliating ride, surviving one political calamity after another. Bill Clinton was now president-elect. As he strode across this stage, Clinton had good reason to be proud. He had persevered through sheer will and force of personality. But a certain cockiness had also crept in. Indeed, within hours of his victory, he would tell key members of his team they were now masters of the universe. Over at transition headquarters, the phones rang off the hook as the team was completely overwhelmed.
We got like 1,000 phone calls that next day. Japanese TV wants to know when they can interview the president-elect, and by the way, he's the Secretary of State. It starts at 8 o'clock the morning after the election.
George, any transition information?
Sure, they knew how to campaign, but they were not quite prepared to govern.
What stands out now is that we didn't know what we didn't know at the time. What we didn't realize deeply enough is that despite all this fiction about a transition, at least metaphorically, the day after the election, this guy is president and will be treated as if he is in many respects, and we weren't ready for it.
It immediately became clear that the words of a president-elect are taken so much more seriously than the rhetoric of a candidate. During the campaign, Bill Clinton had made many promises.
Today I come here with special responsibilities.
On Veterans Day, 8 days after his election, reporters called him on his pledge to allow gays in the military. Another promise that came back to haunt Clinton was his pledge to name a cabinet by Christmas.
I know that some of you may be interested in the cabinet level appointments, and let me tell you that I don't have any to announce today.
One more promise was slowing Clinton down. His vow to name a cabinet that would look like America wasn't as easy as it sounded. Finally, he nominated the first woman ever for Attorney General. But in its haste to meet the Christmas deadline, the Clinton team had failed to thoroughly vet corporate lawyer Zoe Baird.
Senator Gore.
We need to go. But the mother of all Clinton campaign promises was embodied in his team's adage, "It's the economy, stupid." The economic team he put together was remarkable for a Democrat because it was dominated by fiscal conservatives with close ties to the Washington establishment and to Wall Street. The trouble for Clinton was that the government's fiscal house was in worse shape than anyone on his team knew at the time. His old friend, Robert Reich, who would become Labor Secretary, delivered the bad news.
Thank you.
I headed over to the Treasury Department to talk to officials in the Bush administration and try to get the best estimate I possibly could as to how bad the numbers really looked, how bad that deficit was going to be the next year and likely to be in years to come.
And you found out it was going to be worse than you had been told, and you go in December, December 7th, I think it was, you go to tell the president the news. What's his reaction?
The president was not happy when he heard that the projected deficit was much larger than we had assumed, larger than we had been told, larger than the Bush administration had told the public. It meant, and he knew that it meant that we couldn't do everything that he wanted to do, everything that he had promised the public.
So Bill Clinton took office knowing he would have to break many of his campaign promises, something that would earn him a reputation as the compromiser-in-chief.
And so I say to all of you here, let us resolve to reform our politics.
In his inaugural speech, the new president urged Washington to set aside the intrigue, calculation, and maneuvering that dominate every capital. And for exactly 24 hours, Washington would. But all the excitement and promise of their own dreams for governing collided head-on with the cold reality of Washington.
We picked a lot of the wrong battles early on. Rather than simply focus on what we, as we said in the campaign, on the problems of real people and the fixing those problems, We had this whole separate agenda of changing the culture of Washington.
How about all these stories on the lifting of the ban on homosexuals in the military? Is that soon or imminent?
I think the president intends to end discrimination against homosexuals in the military, intends to make an announcement on that policy, and it would be very soon, probably within the next week, but not today.
Is it the compromise?
Through an executive order?
I believe that he said that in the campaign, and I believe that that will be part of the announcement.
George, could you talk?
The veterans in the White House press corps were determined to teach the rookies a lesson. In his very first press briefing, George Stephanopoulos was hit hard on gays in the military and Zoe Baird, whose nomination was in trouble because she'd neglected to pay taxes on household help.
Would the president like Zoe Baird to offer to withdraw her nomination?
You know, he thinks she should make an excellent attorney general.
So he has no interest in asking her to do it, or no expectation that she might at this point?
Not at this point, no.
George, could you talk a little?
It wasn't only Stephanopoulos squirming. 4 days later, in the Roosevelt Room, Bill Clinton and the Joint Chiefs of Staff began to sketch a tortured compromise on gays in the military. Don't ask, don't tell. In a series of tense meetings, Clinton had to invest precious time on an issue he had never intended to force so early. But Republicans and reporters did.
First week of your administration, giving your promise to have the laser focus on the economy to be seen around the country as Military Gay Rights Week. I wonder if in retrospect you think you could have done things differently to avoid that happening.
I don't know how I could have done that. This issue was not put forward in this context by me. It was put forward by those in the United States Senate who sought to make it an issue early on.
Now it had a life of its own. In the process, the new president had unwittingly alienated the military, many in Congress, and much of the public.
We had lost the first week of the White House to an issue where most of the country looked up and said, what are these people doing? They got elected to fix the economy, and nobody heard a thing about the economy.
I believe that this to make economic policy in a much more...
In those first few chaotic weeks, Clinton had spent much of his time in the midst of a squabble about the priorities for his very first budget. The liberals wanted the president to honor his campaign promises, including a middle-class tax cut.
So I had this, I think now, naive notion that you would just then get out your campaign book and start on page 1 and leaf through and enact everything until you got to page 228.
But the fiscal conservatives, such as economic advisor Robert Rubin, now well aware of just how bad the deficit was, fought the liberals tooth and nail.
The president's view was that the circumstances were substantially worse than he or any of us thought they were, and that even though it was a very tough path to take politically, that if he didn't do the tough thing politically, which is deal with the deficit, then the thing that he was elected to do, which is get the economy back on track, wouldn't happen. And the only way he could get the other things he wanted to do done would be get the economy back on track.
That debate effectively ended in this meeting on January 28th. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, implicitly warned Clinton of serious economic consequences if he dragged his heels on the deficit. It didn't take long for the president to concede he would have to break many of his campaign promises.
I had hoped to invest in your future by creating jobs, expanding education, reforming health care, and reducing the debt without asking more of you. And I've worked harder than I've ever worked in my life to meet that goal. But I can't, because the deficit has increased so much.
2 days later, as the president pitched his first budget before the Congress, he acknowledged Greenspan's power.
Alan Greenspan was saying essentially this: unless you dramatically cut the budget deficit, we are not going to reduce short-term interest rates. And if we do not cut short-term interest rates, this economy is going nowhere. It's never going to take off. The price that you must pay for us cutting short-term interest rates and getting this economy moving is you've got to sacrifice your beloved investment agenda.
So at this point, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, has Bill Clinton in a vice grip.
Yeah, Alan Greenspan and the Fed had Bill Clinton in a vice. There was nothing that he could do.
So Clinton's hands were all but tied on the economy. And during the chaos of the first 6 months, the new president, who had come to mend the evil ways of Washington, had instead angered the press, alienated the military, and confused the public. David Gergen, who had worked for 3 Republican presidents, was invited to meet with Bill and Hillary Clinton.
I told him that he was terribly out of position and that he had lurched to the left when he came in, and it sent signals to people like me who thought he was going to be a centrist Democrat, you know, that he lost his moorings. I also had a private conversation with the First Lady saying, you know, it's widely perceived on the outside that you're the one who's pulled him left and that he can't govern here. They didn't understand Washington very well. They didn't understand the dynamics of the press corps. They were having a hard time figuring out Capitol Hill.
But Bill Clinton knew he was in trouble. The pundits were already writing about a failed presidency.
And that he's got a resilience, he's got an inner toughness that sometimes is not appreciated.
The resilience and inner toughness helped Clinton that first summer in Washington. He'd been having trouble with a Congress controlled by Democrats since he came to town. The bungled appointments, gays in the military, the Waco debacle.
These are all independent fiefdoms. And I think it was the first time he had to deal with truly independent forces that could basically say, Mr. President, to hell with you. He didn't like that. Members of Congress, by their very nature, are a nervous group. They tend to react to almost every headline. And I think their initial reaction early on was that there's some chaos here. And that made them very nervous.
Now the centerpiece of the president's economic plan, his very first budget, was badly stalled. So now, as president, he reached over Congress to make his case on television directly to the American people.
We cannot afford not to act. I need your help. I need for you to tell the people's representatives to get on with the people's business.
Are you in favor of it or opposed? Are you for or against the budget?
On Capitol Hill, Clinton's performance generated lots of phone calls, but many in Congress still smelled blood. Clinton was seen as a president who could be rolled.
Right up to the last minute, we didn't know that we had the votes. There was a lot of arm twisting, a lot of holding hands, a lot of reassuring.
The West Wing team returned to what it did best.
Okay, get going here.
The full tilt campaign. A war room was set up to track every vote. It came down to one.
You've made your decision?
Yeah.
Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, an independent-minded Democrat who didn't care much for Clinton.
We had no idea how he was going to vote until the very last moment when his name was called. We had no idea. And for people that are careful vote counters, that scares the hell out of you.
Right up until the last moment, in the White House, there was a sense of drama and foreboding and hope.
You're rolling the dice at that point, and we were rolling the dice with Kerry.
Yes, Mr. President,
In one breath, Senator Kerry castigated Clinton as green and inexperienced, but in the next, he saved the president's neck.
President Clinton, if you're watching now, as I suspect you are, I tell you this. I could not and should not cast a vote that brings down your presidency.
And we watched the tally come in, and we saw that we had enough votes. Al Gore went up, broke the tie, and there was then jubilation. Jubilation. We had won. This was a big one.
What we heard tonight at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue was the sound of gridlock breaking.
Bill Clinton was playing to type. Once again, he was the comeback kid, but this time as President of the United States and on the slender thread of a single vote.
Had he lost, he would not just have lost the budget battle. He would have lost enormous political face. The message would have been, this guy cannot deliver.